Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. It's April 23rd, 2023. We're like, God willing, a week away from the writ being dropped and Alberta politics getting even more crazy than it already is. And Lord knows it's plenty crazy as it stands. We're going to try to make sense of a little bit of that tonight as well on our open forum, which is, I think, what we're going to be calling it going forward. We're going to be talking media. We're going to be talking journalism. We're going to be talking CBC a little bit. It's going to get probably, maybe, hopefully a little bit spicy if people tag in, and if people they don't, then we'll see what we see. But to get started right away, before we jump too far into things, we want to just take a second to turn the clock back a whopping, I think it's 3.5 months.
Sorry for the delay, guys. But I do want to thank you for being here today. Obviously, I have a background in the media, understand the jobs that you have to do, and I have heard from my staff that you want to have a bit more opportunity to ask me questions directly on issues other than the issues that we're doing announcements on. So I know that Ralph Klein used to do this quite frequently, and so I'm happy to be able to accommodate that. And this will be the first, I hope, of many sessions like this.
Just wanted to set the stage with that. That's from a couple months ago when Danielle Smith held a press conference for the sake of having a press conference, where she announced that she was going to have, apparently, perhaps apparently not, press conferences regularly, where she was going to be talking to people and letting the media ask questions, because transparency and accessibility, and her staff were like, Danielle, you got to be more transparent and accessible. She took that seriously, apparently for about 5 whole minutes. But we're going to get into that as we go through the night. Before we do, though, it's fascinating how Alberta just doesn't seem to want to let go of the fact that The Last of Us was filmed in our lovely province just a short while ago. It seems like everybody's trying to revisit that whole ethos. And we saw that again this week when, at a surprisingly early time, it appears that Danielle Smith and the UCP decided to stick with the theme of The Last of Us, and they brought forward the reanimated remains of Stephen Harper.
It's been through some tough years since 2015, but the economy is finally hitting its stride again, and employment is booming. Yet that could all be derailed if the Notley NDP wins. We've seen what they've done before: job killing, tax hiking, anti-energy policies leading to mass layoffs, business closures, and recession. It took years to recover from the last NDP government. We can't risk going backwards again. Vote for Alberta. Vote Conservative.
It's a little bit of peeking, so I'm going to say that he's one of the clickers, is my guess. But there's a lot to unpack in that video. First of all, the fact that the video was even released before the writ has been dropped, even though we're in the campaign season, it seems like it's all very confusing. But typically one would think that if you're going to bring up the great grandfather of conservatism, especially in the province of Alberta, but arguably across Canada, if you're gonna bring out the elder statesman of conservatism, you're gonna do it when it's gonna have maximum impact. You're gonna do it when people are paying close attention. But for reasons, that's not what happened. They decided to roll out this video basically a week and a half, almost 2 weeks before the writ is actually dropped. But what's even more, there's a couple other interesting things about the video. We weren't the first to make the joke. We're going to make it again because we like the joke so much. The only thing that's missing from the sort of the vibe, the feeling of that video is Mr. Harper holding up a newspaper to demonstrate proof of life. The production on that video is, I'm going to say, lower than what we do here, and that's saying something, quite frankly. It was a very, there's some very strange production choices that are going into that. He's up against a very boring wall his delivery is quite dry. But perhaps the most interesting thing about it is he doesn't say vote for the United Conservative Party. He doesn't say vote for Danielle Smith. What he says is don't vote for the NDP, vote Conservative. Which is really quite fascinating because it almost begs the question, was this like a leftover? Was this a B-roll video from the federal election that somehow Team Smith and the UCP got their hands on and they decided, hey, he doesn't say not us. Let's just roll with it and see what happens. It's a fascinating little piece. But moving on from there, Sunday night, we had a bit of conversation about this guy right here. This Tariq Khan. He's the UCP candidate, nomination candidate from 2019, who was disqualified because he shared some things on social media that were anti-Semitic, racist, apparently endorsing terrorism. Not a great look for the UCP. Now, we shared a couple of pictures of the social media posts as well as the letter. We received this letter from one of our anonymous DMs, and it didn't take very long before things heated up pretty quick. The Mr. Khan apologized, but we got to pay close attention to the apology. Now, the full statement hasn't been released. He hasn't posted that on his social media for some reason, but what appears to have been reported on was that he was sorry that he shared those things on social media. So there has not been a publicly made disavowing of those views. It's just, I was new to social media and I didn't know that people would get upset. Paraphrasing a little bit, but that was the full effect of the apology. Now, he resigned after, on Monday morning, the NDP shared some screenshots. Might have been from this show. Hard to say. And they made a big thing out of it. It was the subject of several questions at some press conferences, and Mr. Khan elected to resign, which is not the most optimal choice, perhaps, for the UCP. Because one would think Danielle Smith, Rob Anderson via Danielle Smith, would want to make it very clear that the UCP government, Premier Smith's office, does not in any way condone, support. They actively are going to condemn these views. But instead, Mr. Khan resigned. But there's still some questions that we find ourselves lingering with. And we saw Casey Madhu at a press conference this week do a whole thing about, hey, there's no way we could have known. It's not like we vetted him ourselves and then rejected him ourselves. That's exactly what happened. But there's some other questions that come up because Mr. Khan is a bit of a heavy hitter. It seems like in the little UCP world. Here we have a picture. I'm still getting the right and left thing figured out. Here we have a picture of Mr. Khan where he's with Mohammed Yassin. He's with Mickey Amory. He's campaigning in the 2019 election. He's with Rajan Sani. That's like 3 people who have been UCP ministers he was hanging out with. And it's worth noting again that when we go back to the announcement, and this is the picture of the announcement, who is standing right there? Rajan Sani. So there's a lot of overlap here. But again, there's even more overlap because as we highlighted last week, he went down to campaign for Danielle Smith in her by-election. And again, look who he's hanging out with. There's Mickey Amory again. So this creates some, let's go with some confusion, some apprehension, some questions. Because the first question has to be, there is no way that these people didn't know, especially Rajan Sani, because it's worth noting that the constituency that Tariq Khan wanted to run in is the constituency that Rajan Sani ran in the last election. Not the one she's running in the next election, but the last one. It strains credibility that she would have not been aware at all that one of her nomination competitors got booted because of the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust denial and the go terrorism posts. It's a little bit more than some people would probably believe. It's a little bit difficult to believe that he's been hanging out with Mickey Amory since like at least 2019, before the last election, and Mickey Amory had no idea. How did nobody recognize that they should raise some red flags about this guy getting onto this panel? Or did they just choose to overlook it because, there's an election? And he clearly put it in his time with Danielle Smith. But Mr. Khan was the only one who had a bit of a disqualifying week in Alberta politics, because we also saw the candidate for Fort McMurray get disqualified. Allegedly, he's facing some court action from a fellow party member, no less. And that court action is going to be going on throughout and over the election period. The UCP said, "No, we don't want anything to do with that." And 2 weeks before allegedly the writ is going to be dropped, they decided to bring back Danielle Smith supporter Tanya Yao. Now, there's a lot of complexity and nuance that's going on here, because Tanny is the UCP MLA. He's also the guy, you might remember, he kind of disappeared for a little while during the whole Aloha Gate period. They lost him for a good chunk of time when he was traveling outside of the country after the provincial government had said, hey, don't travel outside the country. So he's got some problems. He also, one would have thought, given that he is the candidate for Fort McMurray, one would have thought that it would have been a no-brainer for him to support Brian Jean in the UCP leadership race, but he didn't. He supported Danielle Smith. So now we've already seen there's an ex-deputy Premier, Thomas Lukasik, the Honorable Thomas Lukasik, who has come forward and said, yeah, this smells a lot like it was probably a hit job. This smells a lot like getting this close to the election. Somebody wanted to make sure that the very good poodle who supported Danielle Smith, who's a current MLA, somebody wanted to make sure that he stayed in as the candidate for the UCP, and maybe there was some chicanery. Maybe there were some shenanigans that happened in order to make this little move occur. But it wasn't all bad for friends of the UCP this week. John Horseman, who campaigned in the UCP leadership race for, I think it was about 10, maybe even a solid 15 minutes. He had himself a really good week. Some of you might remember John announced that he was going to be running in the UCP leadership race. He said that he was, he didn't come with any baggage. He was going to be a great guy to have running in the UCP leadership race. And then I think it was 15, 20 minutes later, he said, you know who's really, though, a great guy? That Travis Taves. He's the best leader. Of all of the leaders, he's the best. We should have Travis Taves running the show. I'm going to drop out of the race and endorse Travis Taves, almost as if that was like some sort of political strategy that some people have speculated on. I don't know. But it happened, nonetheless. Something else happened this week, though, because Mr. Horseman landed himself a nice little gig. He got appointed to the AIMCO board. And when we're talking about AIMCO, we're talking about pensions, which has been a pretty hot button issue over the last little while. Well, Mr. Horseman, who does have a background in finance, to be fair and to be clear, he was appointed to the AIMCO board. But the fun, the cherry on top, that's just so on brand. When we take a look at who appointed him, it was none other than President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Finance, Travis Taves. Because of course it was. Now, some other things that we got to talk about before we get to our main event. A little bit of housekeeping we got to deal with. And one of them has to do with an organization that we keep talking about on the show. We keep talking about them because they're super relevant to this next election. They're super relevant to provincial politics. We're talking about Take Back Alberta. They like to both minimize and maximize their role in provincial politics. It's well known that they were able to install pretty much half the UCP board in the last UCP AGM. They've been doing a fairly effective job of going around rural Alberta and making sure that they're taking over constituency associations to make sure that they're getting their candidates in. We saw one of the big guys for Take Back Alberta run the campaign for Livingstone MacLeod. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly this time. She was backed by him. She's the same one who has that magical $1,500 in anonymous donations that were provided by Give, Send, Go, which have raised a lot of questions. Well, that's not the only constituency that they've been able to do this in. They've been able to do it across the province. Jennifer Johnston is another example of a Take Back Alberta affiliated candidate. And this is part of the problem that we're looking at, because as we get closer and closer to the provincial election, it's looking more and more like this is going to be an extraordinarily close election. There's some polling and some projections that have it within 1 to 2 seats. That's how many seats are going to decide who's forming government, the NDP or the UCP. Now, where this gets to be particularly complicated is when you have a slate, in effect, that have been put together, like Take Back Alberta. If they have 3, 4, 5, 10 MLAs who are on Team Take Back Alberta, if they go to Danielle Smith or whoever replaces Danielle Smith after she ekes out a tiny little victory, if she gets one, and they say, hey, Danielle, so we've got a list. We've got a list of some things that we'd like to have done. You're going to do them, or we're going to form our own little party and you're going to lose government. Or when you put up your next provincial budget, we're going to turn it into a non-confidence vote. So Take Back Alberta is potentially going to be in a place where they could have a lot of power. They could have a lot of sway over the current government. Now, Take Back Alberta has repeatedly said, no, we're not partisan. But there was a couple interesting things that popped up in their Telegram group this week. Benita Peterson, yes, that Benita Peterson, the one who stood outside of hospitals and called nurses liars for treating COVID patients. She put a couple of things in their Telegram group because she's one of their main organizers now. How to encourage individuals to vote Conservative. Free online workshop via Zoom, Sundays, 8 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. And then there's a link that you can register at. Another post that was in the Take Back Alberta Telegram group. I'm getting daily texts now from the UCP War Room. If you're not yet receiving these texts, send me a text and I'll help you get signed up. Benita. Here's the one from today, and then shares the UCP War Room text. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the UCP War Room in a bit, but this seems to fly in the face of how Take Back Alberta has said, no, we're not recommending anyone. We're not affiliated with anyone. From an article just a couple of months ago, Van Hugenbos said TBA, Take Back Alberta, encourages supporters to vote for nominees who prioritize respect for charter rights, but there's no formal endorsement or financial backing. Van Hugenbos, a Fort Macleod town councillor, is facing a charge of mischief over $5,000 in connection with his participation in the 2002 Coots border blockade. Like I said, that's from a CBC article on February 16th, 2023. And this is the reoccurring problem with Take Back Alberta. They say they're one thing, and then they appear to do something else. As a fun little follow-up, we did ask David Parker, the black belt leader of Take Back Alberta, if he could clarify any truth or deny to the rumors that are fairly well substantiated that he's actually married to one of the correspondents, writers, creative writers, I think might possibly be the best term. I could be wrong. For True North. Because as we talked about in an episode a little while ago, we couldn't help but notice that there seemed to be some message coordinating going on between True North and Take Back Alberta, which was super weird. Mr. Parker didn't get back to us, so we'll just leave it at that for the time being. Moving on from there, though, we got us another update about Danny's drug problem. Talking about the children's meds. $80 million of children's medications that were ordered poorly Maybe they got the shipping address wrong. You know, when you're ordering something online and you're trying to get the address in properly, but it auto-populates with something and you're not paying enough attention, and all of a sudden, oh man, my stuff's going to Chicago. Maybe that's what the prolonged delay has been, because we're now in April, almost the end of April. Danielle Smith promised the delivery of these drugs by the end of December. There's a few months in between there. Well, we found out that we were getting the first initial shipments for consumers of the acetaminophen, or the children's Tylenol, a little while back. Finally got word on the children's ibuprofen, or Pedifen, which is, there's something just uncomfortable about that name. That's now going to be available, but kind of, sort of. It's going to be split again between hospitals and retail, which is different than how it was originally announced. And it's really important to highlight that, because there are more than a few people who are suggesting quite passionately that one of the reasons why we're seeing this stuff getting dumped into the hospitals is because they're dumping it into hospitals. They're dumping it into the healthcare system because they spend $80 million buying children's medication at almost double the retail price, where they screwed up the labels and they screwed up the caps, and now they're stuck with all of this product that nobody wants because nobody has any faith in it, and the dosing's different than the regular stuff that everybody's used to. And oh wait, it turns out this stuff, the Pedifen, can't even be sold in other provinces until they receive approval, which again highlights how mismanaged this entire process has been, how this is just a disaster from a procurement standpoint. Because one of the things that they justified at the beginning was, hey, you know what, we probably won't need 4 million bottles. We're going to share. If other provinces want them, they can have them. But that forces the question, why? Why would any other province say, hey, we can have the off-brand Danny brand medication, we just have to jump through a bunch of extra hoops, or we could order the stuff like we regularly do? The supply chain issues have been resolved. Why would any province want to go down that road? It doesn't make any sense. And it just perpetuates the disaster that this whole thing has been. Going to shift gears again and move on to a fascinating little event that happened this week in Calgary. So the Calgary Economic Development announced that they were going to be having a report to the community. At this report to the community, there was going to be a conversation with Danielle Smith, Rachel Notley. Got a lot of people's attention. We're heading into an election, and there's going to be Danielle Smith, Rachel Notley on the stage at the same time having a conversation. They've got some difference of opinions. It could get a little bit spicy. But at the very last minute, plans changed. Now, according to, once again, our DMs, we were told that this was very much a last-minute change in plans. And we saw a little bit of positioning that was done in the social media in regards to this, where they were like, oh, did we say conversation multiple times? We meant conversations. You know, typos happen. But it ended up that Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley had two separate conversations with Mayor Jyoti Gondek. Now, this was a bit of a strange event for a lot of different reasons. We weren't there. We were told it started like 2 hours late because of all of the tomfoolery that went on with the scheduling. It's a little strange that Mayor Gondek would be moderating this. I mean, at this point, it's not a conversation. It's more of an interview. But it certainly caused a lot of eyebrows to be raised. First of all, why either leader would agree to this sort of an event going into an election. There's been no shortage of pundits who have pointed out, well, this was a great way for Danielle Smith to elevate Rachel Notley's profile. And with the fact that Danielle Smith changed the terms of the agreement reportedly and then booked it out of there right away without answering any questions, that gave Rachel Notley the opportunity to answer a bunch of questions, do a big media scrum, have some candidates behind her. Look, it's very strange why Team Danielle Smith would offer to do the agree to do the event in the first place. It's almost as if Danielle Smith can't turn down a microphone. Moving on from there. And this is where we're going to start to get into our more robust content, because there's some things that we definitely have to talk about. There's a new article that came out in Globe and Mail. It was the result of a FOIP request that was done by Alana Smith. And this FOIP request revealed that the UCP government has for some time now been looking at something called involuntary treatment, forced treatment. The basic idea is, hey, you know what? If we've got somebody who's doing the drugs, we don't want them doing the drugs. And if they're doing the drugs too much, subjectively, there's no objective measurement of that, especially when we're talking about the varying quality of drugs that exist on the streets. But if we decide that they're doing too much of the drugs, then we're going to force them into treatment. This is a huge, big deal for a lot of different reasons. The first one being, even the FOIP documents recognized that doing so is a major violation of charter rights. There's no precedent for saying to somebody, hey, I don't like your drug habit, so I'm going to force you to get treatment. There's no precedent for that. Not only is there no precedent for that from a legal standpoint, certainly there's a historical precedent. We've done a great job in this country over time saying, hey, disenfranchised segment of society, we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to force medical procedures on you. We can talk about forced sterilizations. That's part of Canada's history. It's not one that most people would look at and go, you know what? Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe we should go back and this time try it with drug addicts. Maybe if somebody's using drugs, maybe this time it'll work. Nobody, except apparently the UCP, is suggesting that we should do something like that. And I want to get right ahead of the false equivalency argument that I know is going to be coming. The vaccination piece is not the same thing. Nobody came to anybody's homes, took them out of their homes, forced them into a hospital where they had to get vaccinated. Everybody who did or didn't get vaccinated had a choice. Some of those choices came with privileges. Some of those choices came with consequences. But there was always a choice. It was never forced. And that is a tremendous difference, because one would think if the Freedom crowd, who didn't like the choices that they were given when vaccinations first started rolling out, one would think that they would be the first in line, starting up their trucks, putting their flags up high to say, hey, you can't force people into medical institutions to receive treatment. You can't do that. Oddly, we haven't seen any convoys this week for that. It's almost as if that's not what it was about. But the other piece of this that's really, really important to contextualize is the fact that when we're talking about this kind of forced treatment, it doesn't work. But you wouldn't know that if you listen to the press conference that we saw this week with Mike Ellis, when he was asked explicitly whether or not this was something he supported.
Minister Ellis, you were the former Minister of Addictions,
yes.
And we're talking about these involuntary treatment facilities. Do you support that, or?
Well, it's a pretty broad question. I think I've been actually very public in saying that we would be looking at involuntary treatment options. Yeah, I mean, obviously, under the Mental Health Act, we do have involuntary treatment. And obviously, we have what is known as a Form 10. So police officers, if the person is posing a danger to themselves or others, can certainly determine that that person needs to go to get some medical treatment. I think that it can be argued that if somebody is overdosing and being Narcaned anywhere from 5 to 10 times a day, that person likely is posing a potential danger to themselves, and that we may have to do some sort of medical intervention in order to help save their life. So, all options are on the table. I think we have to do whatever it takes to make sure that we protect people. It's part of that recovery-oriented system of care.
Now, there's a lot to unpack in that little statement from Minister Ellis there, who, by the way, is he's very proud to point out, is an ex-police officer, which pretty much makes him an expert in mental health and addictions, #sarcasm. But let's take a look at some of the things that he said there. First of all, he equated somebody using drugs with somebody who would be apprehended under a Form 10. Now, he's absolutely correct. A Form 10 is issued when somebody is a threat to themselves or to others, but the threshold for that threat is pretty freaking high. You have to want to die. Pretty much, period, full stop. There is a world of difference between somebody who is using drugs. Now, they may be using them recreationally. They may be using them to self-medicate. They may be using them because they fell down the rabbit hole of addiction when they were prescribed oxycodone, when everybody thought OxyContin was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you couldn't possibly get addicted to it, but they did. They may have been failed by their prescribing physician. They may have been failed by the medical system, but to equate any of that to saying that that means this person wants to die is unbelievably irresponsible. Using Mr. Ellis's threshold that he talked about right there, are you drinking? Well, you know that it could cause liver failure. We're going to have to arrest you and put you in forcible treatment. Are you driving past the speed limit? Well, we've talked about the fact that speeding has an increased risk of death. So we're going to have to arrest you and clockwork orange your ass. It's a false equivalency, and it's one that preys on fear. But he wasn't done with the false equivalencies or the preying on fear by any.
As soon as a story like this comes out, just like when stories would come out with a previous minister, and it would be about the safe consumption sites and the problems at the safe consumption sites, immediately you would have activists who would come out that minutes, hours later and say, this is a terrible idea, it's awful, we can't do this, what we need is maybe more safe consumption sites or a so-called safe supply of drugs, or they would come up with all sorts of things, but they would immediately try to shut down the idea. And I'm sure that's going to happen today if it hasn't happened already. Just shut down the idea of involuntary treatment. I mean, again, these are largely activists. What do you say to those people who immediately jump on all of these ideas to try to deal with crime, social disorder, and addiction?
Well, I'd say Albertans have had enough of the activists, to be honest with you.
Boy, I want to be in a room when Mr. Ellis decides he's going to say that to take back Alberta. I want to be in a room when Mr. Ellis decides he's going to say that to Canada Action or any of the other groups that are, by definition, activists. There's nothing wrong with being an activist, and in fact, it is the only thing that holds governments to account. Before Mr. Kenney and the UCP government were in power, all of the work that they did to try to get more pipelines was activism. To just say Alberta is tired of activists, to dismiss activism out of hand, is incredibly irresponsible and short-sighted, especially when you consider that some of those activists are in fact experts. The only difference between an expert and an activist is the expert decides that they're going to take some time out of their day to try to raise awareness about the things and the stuff, whatever the subject is. There's no shortage of experts who have become activists. There's no shortage of activists who have become experts. When we take a look at organizations like Moms Stop the Harm, these are people who have been directly impacted, who have become subject matter experts on these issues because they had to. So for Mr. Ellis to just stand up and kind of cock back like that and say, well, Albertans are tired of the activists, not only shows an incredibly dismissive attitude toward expertise, but it also demonstrates an unwillingness to listen. And there are some folks that we should be absolutely listening to. I'm going to play a video for you now. We're going to play it in full because it's critically important. It's been across social media this week because one of those activists, one of those experts who has been not only on the front line of the COVID situation, but certainly on the front line of the opioid crisis for more than a few years now, decided to weigh in and share her thoughts. And the fact that this is somebody who works in an emergency room. This is an emergency room physician you're about to hear, named Dr. Shazma Nathani. The fact that she is so distraught at the direction and the policy that this government is going to implement should give everyone pause. But if there's anyone it should give pause to, it absolutely should be Mike Ellis. And for some reason, the audio on that isn't working. So we're going to come back to that video. We're going to get it working because I don't know why it cut out like that. It's a very, very important video. So we're going to quickly work to get that set up, and then we'll come back to it right away. Let's talk about... I'm gonna vamp on this for a minute because I think I can, and it's only going to take a quick second to get this video uploaded. Here's the thing with this policy. There is a long-standing history with the UCP government of demonstrating that they haven't a clue about what actually works in regards to getting people into treatment, getting them treatment that works for them, and keeping them alive in the meantime. One of the other things that Mr. Ellis talked about while he was pontificating on the harms of drugs and why we need this policy, he shifted gears and started talking about crystal meth. And one of the other things that Rick Bell did in that press conference was he talked about, hey, would this be able to be used for people who are like breaking the law? Would this be able to be used for people who are doing like all the stabbing? And Mike Ellis decided to speculate. And let's be clear, it was speculation. It was nothing more than speculation. He decided to speculate that, all of these recent stabbings that we've seen, all of these recent issues that we've seen with public disorder, all of these are coming from crystal meth, and we have to have a way to stop this and prevent it from happening again. Well, first of all, one would think that a police officer, an ex-police officer, would be able to maybe come up with some ways to stop people from breaking the law when they're actively breaking the law. So if somebody's stabbing someone, for example, one would think that an ex-police officer would be able to say, maybe there's a mechanism that I could utilize here to get the stabbing to stop. But apparently that's just a little bit of a reach for Mr. Ellis for some reason. But the reality is, this UCP government has gone out of their way to discredit effective and actual methods that work for dealing with the opioid crisis. And I want to talk for a quick second about the Lethbridge Supervised Consumption Site, because this is one that they love to go to, and it drives me absolutely crazy. They closed down one of the busiest, the UCP government, whilst having their creme brulee, they closed down one of the busiest supervised consumption sites in North America under false pretense. They claimed that the organization had lost $1 million in change, and that's simply not true. They were able to find that money was never missing after they'd already made the decision to close it down. There is a puritanical bent when it comes to dealing with substance abuse, and the rank hypocrisy that exists in this whole conversation when it comes to the UCP's policies on dealing with the opioid crisis, dealing with addiction, is that it's only the drugs that we don't like. One can't help but wonder if Devin Dreeshen would have been taken away would he have been a candidate for this program? And it's worth noting that they've tried to soft pedal it a little bit. They've come out with an interview where Marshall Smith, who we've talked about on the show before, Danielle Smith's chief of staff, was Jason Luan's chief of staff when they closed the supervised consumption sites. He's got a history with addiction himself. And somehow, according to Danielle Smith, that makes him the foremost expert on addictions in North America. And that's a quote. He's the one who's guiding all of this stuff. But unfortunately, he doesn't have the expertise that everybody seems to think he has. Lived experience alone does not make you an expert, and it certainly doesn't make you the foremost expert. What can make you an expert? Actual education. And I think we've got the video ready to go.
Everyone, so I'm just getting in the car on my way to pick up my kids after school, and I just read an article about this proposed legislation from the Alberta government called the Compassionate Intervention Act, where they can force people against their will to be put into abstinence and recovery programs. And I wasn't expecting to have this reaction, but this is so messed up and completely violates the rights of people. And unfortunately, this is a population that most of the general population can't identify with, and so they don't care about them. And so it's just this population that has no way to advocate for them at all, and they continue to just be forgotten and die without services that they need, without harm reduction, which has evidence behind it. We all know this, and get forced into recovery. And this is just wrong. It's wrong, and it's devastating. And I will keep pushing, I will keep advocating, and just hope that something like this doesn't actually come to fruition, because it's just wrong, and it's a complete violation, and it's not right.
Now, it's worth noting that 2 days ago, Global News put out a news story where they spoke to Marshall Smith, and he said, no, it's all been taken out of context. Here's what would actually happen. If we think that somebody's doing too much of the drugs, then what we'll do is we'll give them a ticket, and they have to go to the hearing. And it's up to them whether or not they want to go into treatment at that point, but they gotta do the hearing. It's like a drug court. So it's all cool, right? That's fine. And if that was it alone, then for sure. But that wasn't it alone. That was just something else that they publicly added in after the fact, because there were a lot of people who said this is a violation in just about every way that's possible. Is the forced treatment piece still available? Is that something that can still happen under the legislation that they're exploring? The answer is yes. Marshall Smith tried to soft pedal it by saying, but look, we do the nice things first, and then we would force people. It doesn't matter what you do first. If you end up in a place where you're forcing someone against their will to get treatment, not only is the evidence crystal clear, it doesn't work, but you're actually doing real harm. And you're violating the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in a way that is in no way comparable to the vaccination question. Moving on from there, we got to talk more about Danielle Smith and the one question problems. Before we do that, I just want to go back to that clip that we played at the very, very beginning, refresh everybody's memory. If you're just joining in, here's the clip. This is from back in a little while.
Sorry for the delay, guys. But I do want to thank you for being here today. Obviously, I have a background in the media, understand the jobs that you have to do, and I have heard from my staff that you want to have a bit more opportunity to ask me questions directly on issues other than the issues that we're doing announcements on. So I know that Ralph Klein used to do this quite frequently, and so I'm happy to be able to accommodate that, and this will be the first, I hope, of many sessions like this.
It was the first and the only of any sessions like that. So that was Danielle Smith a few months ago talking about, hey, I want to be available for the media. Here's Danielle Smith just a few days ago.
Hi, it's Audrey for Radio Canada. Just before asking my questions, I just want to say that we've had a question and a follow-up for years, and I don't understand why we don't have a follow-up this time.
Audrey,
So
it's an election. That's why we're sort of getting into election mode, and so we've lots of people who want to answer questions.
It doesn't change anything.
Well, lots of people want to answer questions, so we want to make sure we get to everybody. Thanks, Audrey. Go ahead, ask your question. Be happy to answer it.
A little bit of a shift in tone. And it's a really important one to talk about. And we kind of talked about this a little bit on our last episode, where, the problem is that if there's no follow-up question, somebody can ask Danielle Smith, hey, so about this forced recovery stuff or this forced treatment stuff, it seems like it's a really bad idea. It seems like the evidence doesn't support it. How are you pursuing? How do you justify pursuing this policy that is unquestionably just going to cause further harm and suffering to people who are already trying to navigate addiction? And Danielle Smith's answer can be, I really like bagels. Next question, please. That's why the follow-ups are so important. And if the follow-ups aren't allowed from a particular reporter or a journalist, then what that means is that they either have to coordinate and the next journalist has to give up their question, or there's just never going to be an answer. And we've seen, history has taught us that Danielle Smith, when she doesn't want to answer a question, she will tap dance all the way around it all day long. But that brings us to this week, because Mr. Casey Badu was asked a fairly similar question at a press conference where, oddly, he was doing follow-ups. And it's in fact worth noting that at pretty much every press conference, except for that last one, there have been follow-ups allowed. This policy only exists for Danielle Smith. Gosh, I wonder why, but let's go to Mr. Badu's answer.
Just a quick question. You're taking follow-up questions from us here today. I'm sure you've heard about the Premier's one-question policy going forward. Is this something you're going to continue to do throughout the campaign, take follow-up questions?
Listen, I support, the Premier's comment. We are in an election season. I think what the Premier was trying to get to is that there are more media folks than we normally have in normal circumstances wanting to get their questions heard. And so we would always make provisions for more questions. For example, I have been at events recently where we have more ethnic media wanting to participate. I think it's important that we create the opportunity for a wide range of media to participate. Thank you. Next one.
Well, I'm sorry, Deputy Premier, you just said we're in an election. Has the writ been dropped?
No. I think I've addressed your question, my friend.
Yeah. No, that was my follow-up as well. You mentioned the election, so just want to be clear, we're not in the formal period, right?
No. I was just trying to, go back to what the Premier said, which is that given the times that we're in, there are more interest in the upcoming election. There are more people, more media houses, more ethnocultural media wanting to ask questions ahead of the election. And so we are taking steps to make sure that we can hear from more media folks than usual.
Any more questions on the floor? Thank you very much.
If I could follow up on safes, I just want to be clear, when you say take action, will Mr. Khan be removed from the Premier's Council?
Now, I think it is, that would be a reasonable expectation. I haven't been briefed on what is next, but I think that would be a reasonable expectation.
Deputy Premier, sorry, just right there, you said that the reason for this one question, no follow-up at Smith's events is so more media get a chance to to ask questions, but on Friday at that press conference you were at, we only went to 6 reporters, 6 questions, and several people who were there in person, including CTV, were snubbed and weren't able to ask questions. Usually you take about 10 reporter questions, 20 questions in total, including follow-up. We're seeing less than a third of that now. So how can you justify that?
I am not sure what you are alluding to, but I was at that media conference as well. I was in the room, and most of the people that were in the room that wanted to ask questions get to ask their questions.
Not true.
Then that concludes the announcement for today.
It's the not true at the end that I absolutely love there. And that's one of the reasons why having a effective journalism is so important, especially heading into the election. I love that video is long, but I love it because watching Casey Madhu turn himself into a pretzel, trying to walk back not only his words but Danielle Smith's own words is really quite something to behold. But we had a little bit more action on this week because the press gallery, the group of journalists that make up the press gallery to cover the legislature, issued a letter saying, "Hey, first of all, this policy is kind of bullshit." Paraphrasing a little bit there, obviously. But B, you've been very vague because on one hand you've said it's one question per journalist. On the other hand, at different times you've said it's one question per outlet. We need to have some clarity here. What's going on? And there was some clarity that was offered at Danielle Smith press conferences going forward, reportedly, bearing in mind that this changes on a dime, but at Danielle Smith press conferences only, there will be one question per reporter, and that's it. It has nothing to do with allowing for more media outlets or media houses, as Mr. Madhu said there, to get more questions in. As you heard the journalist in that clip point out quite effectively, they actually took less questions. So it's not about getting more access and more questions. Danielle Smith says dumb shit in front of microphones, period. This is an effort to try to mitigate Danielle Smith saying dumb shit in front of microphones, period. At a time where we should be seeing the highest level of transparency from anybody who's wanting to run for government, especially given all of the scandals that we've seen from the UCP side of the bench. But let's be clear, the UCP aren't the only one making some rules about how and when they'll interact with media.
Madam, good afternoon. I understand it's your birthday.
Indeed it is.
Happy birthday. All right. Thank you for your saying that you would take questions and follow-up questions. I'm going to take that as your affirmation of openness and transparency when you're dealing with the media. So I do have to ask, the Western Standard news site and our Edmonton reporter, being fully accredited members of the press gallery, why has your party cut us off from receiving the NDP press releases and media advisories?
Well, sir, I very much appreciate the question, and I do appreciate you being here, and thank you very much for the birthday greetings. However, as much as we have in the past taken questions from your bosses, your institution, unfortunately, your publication recently has been engaging in very active homophobic, discriminatory, hateful editorial positioning as it relates to some of our caucus members. And until such time as that is retracted and an apology offered, we will not be answering questions. Happy to reconsider that issue should a retraction and apology be offered. But between now and then, I simply cannot engage in any sort of normalization of that kind of conversation. It is a breach of our human rights code. It's a breach of our charter. It's a breach of basic standards. And so I look forward to hearing from your editors in the future.
Well,
Thank
Madam,
you. Happy to take other questions.
I must dispute your interpretation of our editorial policy. We're not homophobic. We're libertarian. But with all due respect, it's really not for politicians to say that we will talk to this people and not to those people, because are we not all fighting the same election, and are we not all in good standing with both the national and the provincial party? Your Saskatchewan wing of the NDP fields all our questions and sends us their advisories. Why won't you do the same?
So I'm happy to take other questions from folks.
And there were, of course, other questions. Now, there's a whole lot to unpack in that exchange between the leader of the opposition, Rachel Notley, and the Dark Universe version of Alfred Pennyworth, apparently. But let's start with the assertion of, "Oh, madam, I think you're misrepresenting our policies. We're not homophobic. We're libertarian. Let's be crystal clear. You can be a libertarian and be homophobic at the same time. And certainly some of the editorial that we've seen from the Western Standard, which is the outlet, the institution. I love the choice of that word. The institution in question. There has been no shortage of homophobic and not libertarian views. So much so that one of the writers has actually gone so far as to issue his own apology. Now, the challenge that we have here is this is likely, he said cautiously, the editorial that Rachel Notley is referring to, but there's been more than one that has targeted UCP caucus members, particularly Janice Irwin. Now, we'll read the statement here. This came after a profoundly inflammatory, homophobic, transphobic article was written by Raheem Mohammed. His apology reads, I'd like to apologize unreservedly for both the tone and content of my article, Are Albertans Ready for Education Minister Janice Irwin, published yesterday in the Western Standard. And here's where he admits it. In a shameless bid to drive traffic to the website, I knowingly loaded the article with harmful queer transphobic tropes and dog whistles, paying zero mind to the damage my words would do to thousands across Alberta and beyond. I've since had a chance to reacquaint myself with the statistics on violence against queer and trans youth, and I'm truly mortified by my own words. I'll be making a donation to Unison Choruses Canada as a small act of penance, and I'll be taking a break from both commentary and Twitter. Now, that break didn't last very long. And while the Western Standard did delete that article, they didn't apologize for it. And there's a boatload of other articles that they haven't apologized for, a boatload of other editorials. This was just a quick little search of their webpage, and it gives us the headlines, Irwin has no one to blame but herself. Protesters shut down drag queen story hour in Grand Prairie. Drag queen performed at NDP political meeting, was receiving money from kids. Another display of filth and vileness at drag show hosted by Edmonton Unitarian Church. It just goes on and on and on. So it's understandable why an organization like the NDP might say, hey, you keep not only writing stuff that walks right up to the line of hate speech, but you're specifically targeting one of our MLAs, and we're not okay with that. It's understandable why they would do that. Now, a lot of people have gotten outraged because it wasn't just the Western Standard that was, let's go with, rebuked at this press conference. And we're going to play a little video for you here for our Twitter Spaces, folks. It's worth, after the fact, going and watching this. Now, we will admit we did do a little bit of editing to make this a bit more watchable, but here's the video in question. Angry Caillou, Cian Bexty, and his institution, the Counter Signal, were also refuted, removed, rejected at the NDP press conference. And that was, I have to say, I have been struggling for literally years to find the best way to describe what it is that Mr. Bexty does, in my personal opinion. And somebody threw it up on the Twitter machine, and it was perfect. It's performance art. It's not journalism. It's performance art. And you see it perfectly in that clip where Mr. Bexty puts his hands behind his back to make it look like he's been handcuffed. He wasn't handcuffed. He was putting on a show. And the show continued because over the next couple of days, we saw a statement of sorts from the Counter Signal, where the Independent Press Gallery of Canada condemned Rachel Notley. They called her out for removing Mr. Bexley, from the private function, which is what it was. We'll talk about that more in just a couple minutes. But this is where we have to talk a little bit more about what the Independent Press Gallery of Canada is. We talked about it on our True North episode because it's run by the same people. Candace Malcolm formed the Independent Press Gallery of Canada after a bunch of right-wing performance art institutions were rejected from covering federal debates. Now, they sued their way into those debates, arguing that it would cause irreparable harm to their audience if they weren't able to cover them. And because of the short time period, the judge did say, okay, well, you can go in. But that's where we saw for the first, and certainly not the last time, Mr. Bexley asked a question and a politician say, yeah, I'm not talking to you. So the independence of the Independent Press Gallery of Alberta is certainly a little bit questionable. But where it really starts to get interesting is we also saw the UCP War Room, because they didn't learn from the first one. They started up their own war room for the election. We saw the UCP War Room decide to double down on this messaging from the Independent Press Gallery of Canada. And they included a little picture there of little Kean. Look at him. He's got his hands behind his back. Looks very traumatizing. How he chose to put them there to walk off on camera. And it's picture perfect how, as you saw in that video, and if you didn't see it, you should go back and watch it because it's awesome. But if you go back and watch it, you can see Kean locks eyes with the camera that's filming this whole, I don't know, is it interpretive dance? I'm not sure what to call it. But this gets to our big topic of the evening. And this is where, after I've done the little things that we wanted to clarify here, we're going to invite all of our Twitter Spaces audience to come in and weigh in with their thoughts on this situation. Because the reality is, media and journalism has gotten way more complicated than it has ever been before. And a lot of this has to do with the advent of the internet. Now, historically, if you wanted to do any kind of broadcast journalism, you had to have a venue by which to do that. And historically, those venues, the airwaves, were regulated by the government. And they were regulated by the government because those airwaves are supposed to belong to the people. They are the property of the people. And so making sure that the people had some say over what was broadcast and who got to broadcast and how they broadcast responsibly was a really important piece, because there were standards. Now, those standards were typically upheld by the CRTC. But with the advent of the internet, all of a sudden, literally anybody with a cell phone and some free time can start to produce content. That's the whole reason why we're able to do this show. But there's a difference between producing content and producing journalism. Journalism has standards and practices. It has certain requirements. And there's a lot of mis and disinformation about journalism that's really important to highlight. We heard Alfred Pennyworth in that video clip where the exchange with Notley, where he was talking about, well, we're accredited, so how come you won't send us stuff? Accreditation is something that's received from an organization to a journalist. So you can be accredited to cover the legislature, but you're accredited to do that by the legislature. Being accredited at the legislature doesn't mean that you're automatically accredited to go cover the Olympics or to cover a private event. Private events are still private events. Private events, particularly on private property, are private events. And nobody owes anyone any kind of legal responsibility to answer their questions. Historically, the way that that's been managed has been, if you subscribe to the standards and practices that exist inside journalism, if you adhere to those, then you would be allowed into these private functions, these private venues, where you can have access to the people who are doing the things. So Rachel Notley in her press conference, for example, that's how it's historically worked. But what we've seen over the last bunch of years has been a bunch of people who have figured out, hey, I got this really nice camera on my cell phone. I could go down to Rachel Notley's press conference and I can have a temper tantrum if she doesn't answer my questions. And I can turn that into a whole lot of subscriptions. I can turn that into a whole lot of rage farming. And we're seeing more and more coordination from some of the people who are operating these institutions. But it's really important to understand that when we're talking about media and journalism, there's a really big difference. This is one of the reasons why here at The Breakdown, we make it very, very clear. We're not journalists. We try to share information, and we certainly try to entertain, but we have not, nor will we ever claim to be journalists, because we don't follow all of the standards and practices that journalists do, in part because we don't have the funding for it. But that's okay. It's also really important to understand that doing real journalism does require resources. It does require supports. It does require editors. That stuff doesn't come for free. And it's fascinating that we're seeing people on certain sides of the political spectrum go after journalistic institutions because they're government funded. And I want to take a quick sec to talk about this whole defund the CBC bullshit, because that's what it is. There's no journalistic institution that hasn't made mistakes. It's how that institution responds to their mistakes that's what really matters. There's no editorial control between the federal government and the CBC. That's part of the reason why certain segments of the political spectrum have taken it upon themselves to start their own media wings, to start their own media organizations. And you can see in the episode that we did on True North, there's no shortage of people who stood up at the time of the fake immigration swearing in and said, well, this makes it pretty clear Sun News Media is the official propaganda wing of the Conservative Party. Now, you could do with that what you will. Those statements are in that episode. But the reality is, there's no editorial control at the CBC by the federal government. They are funded in part by taxpayer dollars, sure, but so is Post Media, so is Global, so is CTV, so is every major journalistic entity out there. Because here's the bottom line. People don't pay for quality journalism enough anymore. And it gets really complicated really quick, because part of the conversation has to be, and we've said it many times on the show before, we'll continue to say it, the foundation of any healthy, effective democracy is a well-informed electorate. Bob the plumber can't just go down to the legislature and ask Rachel Notley questions. He can't just go down to the legislature and ask Danielle Smith questions, because he's busy being Bob the plumber. He's got stuff to take care of. He's got a family to take care of. He's got a business to run. He can't do that. And that's the role that journalists are supposed to fill. But what's happened is that because there's so much content that's being created by people who are presenting themselves as journalists, when they don't utilize the same standards and practices that real journalists do, they flooded the market with bullshit. And that gives people the sense that they can go to organizations and institutions like some of the ones that we've been talking about tonight and get the news. But what they're getting is biased spin that's designed to make people upset and designed to make money. So how does a journalistic organization compete with that? Because real journalism at its core isn't about giving everyone candy. It's asking people to face reality. It's asking people to eat their vegetables. Not a lot of people like to do that. So if I can go to outlet X and feel like I've been informed, as opposed to going to CBC or Global or the Tyee or whatever, why am I going to do that? And we've seen a atrophy that's occurred in journalism, not only because a lot of these outlets have been bought out, but also because the money just isn't there from advertising anymore. The market has changed dramatically. Some journalistic entities have tried to combat that by implementing paywalls. But then you run into the problem of, how is the electorate well informed if they can't afford the paywall? It gets really, really complicated really quick. But one thing's for certain, when you have bad faith actors out there who are trying to rage farm in order to drive people to their websites, it has a toxic effect on the conversation. It has a toxic effect on what journalism can actually do. The NDP don't have to accredit anyone they don't want to. If they're doing a press conference on private property, nobody who's not invited has the right to be there. What Keean Bexty and what the Western Standard are trying to do is literally walk into your living room and say, I have some questions for you. I've got my phone recording. You'll answer them now, right? Now, there's certainly a flip side of the coin and a counter argument to be made that people who are in positions of public service do have to be accountable. There's no question about that. This is why it's very easy for us at the breakdown to say, hey, it's totally understandable why Rachel Notley wouldn't want to talk to the Western Standard, why Rachel Notley wouldn't want to talk to the Counter Signal, and why Rachel Notley doesn't want to talk to us. It's totally understandable because we're not journalists. But at the same time, if Rachel Notley was to say, you know what, I don't care who you're with. I don't care whether or not you have a history of writing editorials that walk right up to the line of hate speech. I don't care. I'm saying nobody gets a follow-up question. Then there would be real cause for concern. Equating what Rachel Notley is doing with what Danielle Smith is doing is a false equivalency. It doesn't work. Now, there's some very real concerns to be asked. Some very real questions to be asked about how the NDP is making decisions in regards to who gets accredited, who doesn't, what their media policy is. We've done literally, I think, 6 episodes on how much control the NDP exercises over their message, not only externally, but internally. There's some problems that need to be addressed there. And by the way, some of those problems the NDP have even acknowledged as existing themselves. Neither Danielle Smith and the UCP nor Rachel Notley and the NDP are perfectly clean in any of this. But the people who are really dirty in this are the people who are misrepresenting what journalism is, what their intentions are, and what their affiliations are. Those are the people who are poisoning the conversation the most. People who show up at press conferences and ask bad faith questions should be ignored. If you're going to do actual journalism, you shouldn't be ignored. But if you're going to show up to a press conference and instead of ask questions to hear the answers of the people who are in positions of power, instead of asking those questions, you're going to try to advance your own agenda, you got no business being there. We've already got a couple of people lined up on the Twitter Spaces, so we're going to get right into it. First of all, and I think we might be talking about children's meds, but I'm not entirely sure. Very excited to welcome back to the forum, the open forum, if you will, Mr. Ziad Fazel. Ziad, how's it going? Oh, Ziad's mic is muted. Or perhaps he's wandered off to get a cup of tea.
No, I'm here, and yeah, I was just cutting over from YouTube to my phone.
What's going on, sir?
I just sent 2 links in response to your tweet about this Spaces. on the topic of propaganda, and right in line with what you were talking about. So the first link I sent is about how particularly people in power or the government in power uses propaganda. And it may not necessarily be to persuade you of their message, but it's to remind you or to instill in you a fear of them being in power and having impunity. So this is very much the Danielle Smith one question example, where with no follow-up, where she said that on a Friday, and then on Saturday she went on her private radio show with QR 770, and she announced that's not just one question, no follow-up per reporter, but it's one question, no follow-up per media outlet. And she brought in this rule in an interview only with one media outlet that has a supportive host that largely feeds her puffball questions, and where the questions appear to be screened somewhat, or at least she's allowed the opportunity to dance around and not answer the question when it's asked of her. So this one question, one per reporter, that then became one question per media outlet on a show that wasn't accessible to all media, is just sort of an attempt to show power and will not really persuade you of anything. The second link I sent about propaganda is more of a general article, but there's some of the 4 or 5 different types or goals of propaganda tie into what you were talking about with these impotent, insignificant, the Journalism Association, where the goal is not necessarily to persuade you of a different viewpoint or to disinform you, it's to disempower you. It's to leave you confused and unable to make a decision, unable to discern between the truth and the lie because you're being gaslit so much. And you're being gaslit by people that claim to be independent journalists. And yeah, the point you're making, we don't get a chance individually to ask Danielle Smith or ask the cabinet minister a question. And we haven't had question period in the legislature for a long time. And I think since Danielle Smith became premier in October, we've had maybe a record shortest amount of legislature days where the government can be held accountable by the opposition.
They cut 2 weeks off.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
They cut 2 weeks off. They cut the first. Danielle Smith has only had 2 sessions since she became premier, and
Yeah.
both of them she's ended a week early.
Yeah. So we're reliant on journalists to be our proxies, to be our agents, to ask questions of the people in power for us. So yeah, we're very dependent. On children's meds, I don't have much. You can come back to me later if you want. There's more background behind the Kevin J. Johnston decision, the AHS versus Kevin J. Johnston decision that was announced about a week ago, the $650,000 dinger that he caught. So there's more there with respect to torts and with respect to the capability of a government agency to sue a citizen for defamation. So if you want, I can talk about those. I just want to look at the judgment again. And then, I can come back a little bit later. I'll give you a chance to talk to some of your other folks. But if you want, you can come back to me. I'll have an update on the AHS disclosure on the Vance masks, if you like.
Yeah, we'll
definitely
come back to you. I wanna tread lightly around the Kevin J. Johnson thing, not just because A, I don't want to give him any more daylight than he needs, but B, because I have some bias there. I got into a bit of a dust up with Mr. Johnston myself during the municipal campaign. It was kind of a thing. So I have to disclose that and be mindful how I speak about it, because I was very clear that, it's interesting. I refused to do a debate with him, and I refused to do the debate because of his history with hate speech, and that turned into a whole. Boy, he doesn't like having the mirror held up, I'll say. So I would have loved to have been in the room when the judgment was handed down, but we will come back to Ziad, because you're right. We do have a few extra people in the Ricks today. We're going to go through everybody. If you stick around, we're going to work our way through it. We got Lynn, and I'm going to add Lynn in right now because I always enjoy hearing from Lynn. I hope I haven't made you too angry tonight, Lynn. What's going on?
No, you just have so much going on. True question. since Tanny or Brian Jean's office won't answer their phone or call me back,
Of course
like
not.
seriously, this is why we need journalists. And of course, we don't have hardly any left in Fort McMurray. But when you say about he's not firing on all pistons, Tanny doesn't fire on any pistons. But what is going on? Like, when I look across the river, whose signs am I going to see?
I mean, that depends because, I mean, one of the things that we saw, Thomas Lukasik, spoiler alert, we've got a really spicy episode coming up on Wednesday.
Oh my God, are you having Thomas on?
We did already. We were just in the process of editing the interview. It'll be up for our Patreon folks tomorrow. But yeah, we got Thomas on, and it's it's a spicy meatball. I'm not gonna lie. But as Thomas has said, yeah, right now, UCP caucus and ministers are apparently having a debate with Danielle Smith about, hey, we would really like it if your name wasn't on the signage because we want a fighting chance. So,
oh, I get that.
whose signs are you going to see? I guess it'll depend on what the final version goes to the printer.
But no, am I going to see Tanny's name or am I going to see the other guy's name that I can't remember right now?
You will see Tanny's. Because it's again, this is one of the things where if you take a look, and this is where the UCP bylaws have already been arguably walked all over. As per the UCP bylaws, Danielle Smith has the opportunity to name 4 candidates. And she maxed that out a while ago, but there's this other little subheading in there that says, but the board can override any of these rules. And the board has overridden the rules and said, yeah, because we have a plane on fire falling out of the sky, we're going to let Danielle Smith name some more candidates. So the party ultimately gets to say.
Okay.
The constituency association can have the nomination, but the party is the one who does the vetting, and the party is the one who decides who's running under the party banner. It's unbelievably not in line with the grassroots guarantee and all of that. But at the end of the day, as Mr. Kenney said when he first took office, it's the person who's sitting in the leader's chair who holds the pen.
Okay, but just for me and my, people that I might influence, who's the Take Back Alberta candidate?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. And I have to be careful because one of the things is, while Take Back Alberta has very clearly worked with and supported some folks, they're very, very careful about who they endorse or organize for. I mean, it's very easy to look at Chelsea Petrovich and say, well, Marco Van Hugenbos was her guy in that campaign. So clearly that's what's going on there. And certainly we can look at Jennifer Johnston and see that David Parker was involved in supporting that. But
so that's a question I need to ask. I mean, I've already asked Brian Jeans both his offices, and I was promised to call back a week and a half ago. I left messages last week in Tanny and his about their stance on Take Back Alberta, and surprisingly, no one's called me back.
Well, he could be in his condo. Maybe it's the wrong number. Maybe you need to call the admin. I'm just joking. No, and this is one thing that I think you're absolutely right on, Lynn. I think especially when it comes to UCP candidates in this election, because of the influence that Take Back Alberta potentially could have over government, I think that it's incumbent for any UCP candidates to make it clear where their stance is. And if they're in bed with Take Back Alberta, if that's whose team you're playing on, that's entirely your prerogative. But you should at least be clear about it.
I think we all need to ask the UCP candidates in our districts if they're on their side, because I think that's a key thing right now. Now, when it comes to, this is a question I'm going to ask them again next week. When it comes to this forced, whatever you want to call it, I mean, if you live in Fort McMurray and Brian Jean doesn't live far from the homeless people, you get to know them through the different programs in town. And I mean, I was crying with that doctor the other day because some of these people, you just can't force these people to do things like this. Like, it's just,
It doesn't work.
Absolutely. It just breaks my heart. You know, I just don't understand what they're doing. And so I'll ask them that question, but I'll let you go on to another person. Thanks for your information, Nate, and I'll try and figure out who Take Back Alberta is supporting in this.
If you find out, please let me know.
I'll DM you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Okay, good night, Nate.
All right, we have Cassandra is next in line. So we're going to bring Cassandra in, and then we have Herc and the Crow, which I'm hoping is a Brandon Lee reference, but we'll get to that in a bit. Cassandra, what's going on tonight?
I have so much to say. I wanted to talk about the first part, but I'm actually going to talk about, because we were about the journalistic part, because we're talking about press galleries, and there was something that happened with Rebel News. There's actually something on the Canadian Association of Journalists website, and it was a press release they made in August 2020, and it was the National Board of Canadian Association gathered for regular meeting. One of our main agenda items was to discuss recent use of the Alberta Legislative Press Gallery's refusal to issue membership to employees of Rebel News. Now, it talks about Post Media also decided to pull its newspapers from the press gallery, and basically the CAJ respects their prerogative to operate their newsroom as they see fit. We are concerned this decision could place its journalists in a difficult position. But it also goes on to talk about press galleries are independent, self-regulatory bodies that have been long part of Canadian legislators. They're recognized by the Speaker to oversee the press accreditation process and other rules for legislative journalists. Press galleries have a right and responsibility to admit as members only those who meet the standards and definitions for journalism, so long as the process is transparent and fair. It also talks about another time when I think the NDP had led government blocked access to the legislature to members of Rebel News, but it also talks about Rebel News admittedly having its credentials denied by the press gallery itself in the Parliament. So it basically has this long history of doing it. But what's more interesting in this article, and I won't read everything, of course, is that it talks a lot when it's talking about Rebel News, it's talking about a lot of the same kinds of behaviors that you were just discussing in regards to Western Standard. And so they outline a lot of the same behaviors. And this is again, it's the Canadian Association of Journalists. And I'll skip down. So it says much of this is openly posted in their, okay. So the Canadian Association of Journalists has previously noted inconsistencies with our suggested code of ethics, particularly the following points. We do not allow our own biases to impede fair and accurate reporting. We carefully consider our political activities and community involvements, including those online, and refrain from taking part in demonstrations, signing petitions, doing public relations work, fundraising, or making financial contributions if there is a chance we'll be covering the campaign, activity, or group involved. And and they go on to say this replaces Rebel News outside the definition the Canadian Association of Journalists uses to distinguish our members. This distinction was similarly reinforced by Justice Derek Green as he considered who has constitutional protection as a journalist in the context of, it names the Justin Brake case. I'm not familiar with it, but it says in the decision on March 28, 2019, Justice Green stated that one condition for constitutional protection was that he or she, the journalist, is not actively assisting, participating with, or advocating for the protesters about whom the reports are being made. And it goes, so they basically denied access to the Canadian Association. Rebel News journalists were basically don't have membership to the Canadian Association of Journalists in closing because of that. And it's for a lot of this very same things that you outlined when you were talking about some of the behaviors and actions of Western Standard. And that's my thing.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that there's two ways to kind of look at it. I think that empirical reading of what are the standards and practices, what are the rules, that is critically important. But when it comes to Mr. Levant and his journalistic credentials, you don't have to ask anyone other than Mr. Levant. Because in 2014, he testified in court, I'm a commentator, I'm a pundit. I don't think in my entire life I've ever called myself a reporter. So Mr. Levant, when pressed under penalty of law, is apparently the first to admit that what he practices is not journalism.
Well, and it outlines that in this letter as well, exactly. By the way. Yeah. I just was trying to get to the finer points about, what are the standards that the Canadian Association of Journalists puts forward and expects from their members. Yeah. Because I think that's even more important when you're talking about, who is a particular legislative or parliamentary press gallery letting in and they're giving accreditation. But there's another form of accreditation, and that's this Canadian Association of Journalists. And they seem to have a different standard than maybe what's happening.
I think every organization does. I mean, I've had people reach out and say, hey, we would accredit the breakdown to cover this event. And we've said, oh, God, no. We don't want that because we don't want to blur that line. We'll go to events and we'll hang out and we'll make jokes and maybe get some B-roll, but we do not want to misrepresent ourselves in any way. And I think that the thing that I wish that the Keean Bexties and the Western Standards understood is you don't get credibility because of the lanyard. You earn the lanyard with your credibility. The credibility comes intrinsically from the work that you do. It doesn't come from the piece of paper.
Well, and so it should be. And you're 100%. I'm with you. That's what it should. It just, in my opinion, through my observation, when press galleries who are journalists, the press gallery they're journalists deciding who gets to be a part of that, and they're not even when they're deciding who can get that accreditation through them, they're not even considering what the larger body about that kind of the journalistic body that looks over what makes an accredited journalist, if they're ignoring that when they're deciding who they're admitting, that to me seems problematic.
I think one of the other points that's worth highlighting, and I've been corrected on this very passionately a few times, which is why I want to bring it up, because otherwise I know I'll get corrected passionately for not bringing it up. The Rebel wasn't admitted to the legislature by the press gallery. The Rebel was admitted by Nathan.
I'm talking yeah, I know that, and I mentioned that earlier. Yeah.
I agree with everything that you're saying, and I this is one of the reasons. One of the ideas that we.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but that's kind of the point, right? Why would the Rebel News not be admitted, but somehow the Western Standard's okay? You know what I mean?
I don't believe that the Western Standard is part of the official press gallery for the legislature.
Oh no, okay. Okay, then maybe I misunderstood. I still have an issue with them, but anyway, that's my issue.
I do too. Don't get me wrong. I've called out the Western Standard on more than one occasion, and I do think that there are questions about inconsistencies in regards to who the Speaker of the House decides to allow to cover the internal workings of the legislature. I mean, this was what I was going to say a minute ago. Is we floated the idea earlier this week. Should the term journalist be a protected title? in the sense
Yeah.
that a physician, somebody calling themselves a doctor is a protected title. Me calling myself a paramedic, that's a protected title. There's lots of titles that you have to demonstrate a minimum standard to be able to hold that title. I don't think that that means that people should not be allowed to generate content because we'd be screwed.
You know what, Nate? I had to take an ethics course and pass a test on that ethics course just to sell a car.
This is what I'm saying.
You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, at minimum, when we're talking about a democracy and how it's run and the importance of journalism in that ecosystem, yeah, I think it's very important that they should have to meet a certain minimum standard.
Yeah, I totally agree. Anything else that you wanted to throw in there, Cassandra?
Oh, you know what? I could go on for hours about the clean fixing sites. I was volunteering and working on the downtown east side of Vancouver when the very first in Canada was established. And at the time, a friend of mine wrote an article that went into the Vancouver Sun, and it was called "Sins of the City," and it was talking about, at that time, the rate of spread of Hep C and HIV rivaled that of the highest, like third world countries that had the highest rates. The downtown east side was rivaling that, and that is a big part of why that was pushed for and Insight was set up. And it not like the effects, how much it reduced that spread of those diseases was huge. And it did it very quickly. But it also did another thing, in that was because there were nurses on site, it also avoided and prevented death and even hospitalization from overdoses and stuff like that. And so it saved a lot of lives in a lot of ways. And they're very important. It's a very important harm reduction tool. And it's also a place where addicts, when they're there, can access resources that might be harder to access, but because they have to go there, and or it's a place to go where they can be safe in administering, their drugs, and it tends to give them more opportunity to access those resources as well, which is another reason why it's an important part of, reducing deaths and even helping people overcome addiction.
Absolutely.
And that's all I got to say.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree. And we've done bits where we've taken a look at the numbers as well on the impact and the diversion rates that supervised consumption sites offer, where they are able to get people into treatment, are actually impressively high. They have a net negative effect on the needle debris that you see on the streets. They literally take in more needles than they hand out, so they're literally cleaning up the streets in regard when it comes to needle debris and paraphernalia debris. So there is a huge amount of mis and disinformation that exists around supervised consumption sites, but the reality is that all of the evidence shows that they do an incredible amount of good. And it makes you brought up East Hastings, so I'm gonna jump into that one because that's one of my biggest pet peeves. Anybody who talks about the situation in East Hastings and whether or not the supervised consumption sites and the measures that have been done there are effective or not. We see these documentaries that get produced where people are like, "Oh, it's the worst thing that's ever happened." No, the reason why East Hastings exists and the reason why it has had the challenges that it has is because of a failure of the mental health system when the BC government closed a bunch of institutions, threw people out on the streets without any supports, without any protections, and there were people who preyed on them and abused that situation. Period. End of
Oh,
sentence.
100%, Nate. I'm very well. Obviously I know a lot about it, and you're 100% correct. And I just want to say that, like, that is 100% a big part of the problem.
It makes me crazy when they try to present it as, "Oh, it's just the drugs." No, it's not. And if you're going to talk about it that way, cough, Marshall Smith, cough, you don't have a clue what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of things that stem out from it too. Like, yeah, I mean, a lot of people that end up homeless might not be addicted when they become homeless, and they might become addicted. Women that are trafficked into the sex industry often go unclean, and they end up addicted because it's a coping mechanism. And it's the same with mental health. All of these things, a lot of times when you see people on the street, many of them had, if you sit down and talk to them, had very illustrious um, lives, and were even middle class and higher at one time, and something significant happened in their lives that drove them there, and often the addiction comes later.
Yep. Love it. Thank you, Cassandra. I appreciate that. We've got one other speaker that I want to get to before we go back to Ziad, and this looks like it is Herc. So, Herc, I know you've been waiting for a little while. Thanks for sticking around. What do you got to say?
Greetings, sir. I am an American activist who's been trying to learn about Canadian politics, and when I heard Jagmeet Singh call the truckers terrorists, I went on Spaces and started saying, no, Singh and Trudeau are the terrorists. And a Canadian lawyer came in and said, if I was Canadian living in Canada, that I could be incarcerated just for calling Jagmeet and Trudeau a terrorist. And I was wondering if that was true.
No, it's not true. And yes, they were terrorists. Not all of them, to be clear. I'm sure that there were plenty of people who were involved in the convoy who, were just looking for a good time with bouncy castles. But when we're talking about the Coots border crossing, there were people who were there who were planning to kill police officers. Period. Full stop. There were people in the convoy and in the border blockades who were terrorists. End of story. I don't have a problem saying that, and I don't think I'm going to go to jail for saying that. But if you're bringing weapons to an illegal border crossing, and you have openly said that allegedly openly said that you are planning to kill police officers, you're prepared to kill police officers, if you're providing speeches at that illegal border crossing, when you are saying let's make this our Alamo, I mean, there's some American history for you. You're well into the terrorism. The definition of terrorism is literally the use of force to achieve political means. When you start to bring weapons to border crossings, when you start to block border crossings, and as we saw in Eastern Canada, when you start to use children as human shields, in my book, you're a terrorist. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm just curious. So Canadians are free to call their leaders terrorists,
sure.
For instance? Okay. And with these new censorship laws, do people have to ask permission to share stuff privately, like in an email?
What new censorship laws are you talking about there, my friend?
I think it's C11 and C18.
Yeah, that's not true either. You're getting some bad information. So what those laws are driving at, and they're currently going through the Senate as well. So that it's a work in progress, to say the very least. But when we're talking about those laws, what those laws are trying to address is to ensure that Canadians have access to Canadian content as a priority. It has nothing to do with whether or not you can share content on social media, whether you can DM somebody content, or whether or not you can send an email. That's something that has been completely blown out of proportion, and those bills aren't a thing yet. So the intent is no different than the CanCon laws that existed in the 80s and 90s that saw Canadian bands getting a lot of exposure that they wouldn't otherwise have gotten. It simply mandated that a certain amount of content that was available had to be of Canadian origin, or at least have Canadian affiliation. I remember there were bands in the 90s that had like one guy who like moved microphones on the recording was Canadian, and so that was enough to squeak it into the CanCon category. But it has absolutely nothing to do with internet censorship. That's something that's been manufactured and something that has been generated to drive fear. But nobody who has read any of the drafts of the bills are looking at it and going, oh, they're totally going to shut down my ability to post a picture of my dog on Facebook. It's not a thing.
Well, that's what I get for going into those conspiracy rooms. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for being willing to ask the question. And you raise a really good point with the conspiracy rooms, and because there is, one of the things that happens a lot, and it has certainly happened with the convoy folks, is that you'll get somebody who says something and it sounds really bad. We've seen this play out certainly in the United States as well, where, we think about the Pizzagate thing, where somebody was like, oh my God, they're sacrificing children in the basement of this pizza place. And, if you're somebody who likes kids, that sounds terrible. And if you don't have the wherewithal to take a step, and if there's lots of people reinforcing it, like, no, I swear I heard this is true, it's very, very easy to go down that rabbit hole of like, oh my God, they're sacrificing kids in the basement of the pizza place. Or the Canadian version, there's plenty of them, the 5G and the vaccines and all of that nonsense. There's lots of those things that exist. And if you have a space where everybody is saying exactly what you want to hear, it gets to be really, really dangerous. You have to be willing to have those dissenting and disagreeing voices. So I really appreciate you coming on asking those questions, man. Above and beyond that, I'm going to come back to Ziad because he's going to raise my blood pressure before I plug our upcoming episode with Thomas Lukasik. It's so spicy. I'm so excited about it. But Ziad, go ahead. Let's make me unhealthy for 5-10 minutes.
Thanks. Yeah, let's put the cuff on your arm and monitor it for safety.
There we go.
I just wanted to say, to follow up on what Herc was saying there, there's a technique people use in some of these rooms, some of these Facebook debates or in spaces. It's known as the Gish Gallop. And it's where you're in a debate with someone and they hit you with about 10, 15 points all in a row. Zip, 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 zip. And they're seemingly overwhelming you with their tremendous knowledge of all these wrongs or harms that someone is, let's say someone that you support is doing. And so you really have to watch out for that. You see that a lot. It's known as the Gish Gallop. And the way to fight it is to stop just at one point or the second point, slow it all down and look at that one point. And generally you can find from good authoritative sources that first point is kakapupu. And then, the person might try to gish gallop again and you go, okay, now let's look at your second point. And then after a while, after one or two or three of these where the person that's trying to gish gallop all over you realizes that you're going to slow it down and you're going to call kakapupu what it is, excuse my language, on a Sunday night around the hour, it's going to stop it. The thing I wanted to mention with Alberta Health Services versus defendant case, so it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the individual gentleman. It's just, there are some really good lawyers in Alberta that comment on cases like this. Sean Fluker with the AB Law blog, from the University of Calgary is one. He hasn't posted on this yet. And I think, just some of the lawyers who do this are busy with campaigns or haven't got to it yet. The decision was released on the 12th of April. But there were a couple of things in there that I wanted to point out that I think are useful for people like me and other people on this call who do advocacy or who make comments, independent folks like let's say yourself, Nate, as well, too, that make comments about public bodies or make comments about officials. So I wanted to talk about some of those things. So overall, it's 100 and roughly 30 paragraph judgment.
A light read.
And yeah, a light read. And, the judge has written it in a fairly accessible way. I think if you've done some post-secondary education, you can handle it. There's a little bit of sort of legalistic language, but otherwise, the judge lays it out in a pretty clear way. And so, there's a little bit of introduction stuff in the first 20 paragraphs or so. And then at paragraph 23, the judge talks about SLAP, or strategic lawsuits against public participation. And the defendant in this case tried to rely on Ontario legislation, which has a SLAP, anti-SLAP provision in its legislation, to argue that what's happening here to the defendant here in Alberta was wrong. And so, yeah, there is no, unfortunately, for many people I know, no anti-SLAP legislation in Alberta, but you have to use Rule 368 of the Alberta Rules of Court, which handles abuse of process. So for people who are, I suspect many of your listeners are involved in things like this. So Rule 368 and the way the court describes it from paragraph 23 to 27 in this judgment is handy. The other thing, particularly for people, I think I myself might have said AHS lied once or twice, and I probably will do so again in the next week. So the judge specifically went from paragraph 28 through paragraph 59 in depth about whether AHS can bring a defamation lawsuit. And the judge looked at Canadian cases, international cases, whether public entities as a government can maintain a defamation action, and then is AHS government? And AHS tried to say, no, we're not government, and the judge shredded that. So it's a little bit reassuring where you see a public body behaving essentially, in my view, lying and harming workers with things like the VANCH masks. It's reassuring to know that a government body cannot override the charter rights of citizens to speak in a democracy and our freedom of association, our freedom of expression. They cannot override that with the power of the state. So if I were to say AHS lied, and I have they cannot sue me for saying so, because that would be an overpowering defeat or attack on my freedom of expression. The other thing AHS did here, it's the legal tactic of throw all the spaghetti on the wall and hope some of it sticks. So there's a category of the law called a tort. I just want to say I'm not a lawyer here. I'm interpreting as best as I can until legal analysts weigh in, which I think they're going to do more. There's a thing called a tort, and a tort is where you owe someone a duty of care, even though you don't have a contract with them. So, I may not have a contract with my neighbor, but I can't go throwing my garbage in their yard. So I have a tort duty to them. There may be other laws preventing me from doing that. So the AHS attempted to ding the defendant with a tort of invasion of privacy. And because the defendant was using social media photographs and posts by some of the AHS employees, that didn't fly. They also tried the tort of assault, and the judge felt that the defendant's conduct didn't reach that level. They tried the tort of harassment, and there the judge found that the tort of harassment could be applied. And so out of the $650,000 of damages that the defendant was ordered to pay, $300,000 is for the defamation, but of the individual employee, not of AHS. $100,000 was for harassment, that tort of harassment. There's also some special damages of the security system if the AHS employee provides that receipt. And then $250,000 in aggravated damages, which is quite an amount. So it's impressive to see AHS work very hard to protect its employees and protect its public health inspectors. And that's important for us to have a safe society, as public health inspectors should not be subject to harassment. They should be allowed to do their job, whether it's a COVID restriction or whether it's a restaurant or whether it's a public event. So that kind of protection is very important. Just a segue to the other thing that I'm going to be doing over the next week. It's unfortunate and it's disgusting that AHS does not protect its employees when it comes to things like VANCH masks. And so I talked about this a little bit last week. I've gone through 900 pages of disclosure, 3 separate disclosures from AHS, and AHS has been covering up the material safety data sheets for the VANCH masks, as well as chemical testing and biological testing that would show why the VANCH masks are irritating workers' faces. And on 2 separate follow-up requests, we see that AHS suppressed that. And so I got delayed a little bit. I had to go through these hundreds of pages because there was inconsistencies in how AHS applied redactions to protect the identities of people who disclose their personal health information. So there are hundreds of AHS employees that emailed AHS as directed by AHS's publication on the VANCH masks to report their health issues that they're getting. And AHS was, let's say, inconsistent in redacting that information. I've advised the workers affected that their privacy was breached, and some of them have told me some very interesting things about what was going on between them and AHS. So I'm going to continue to protect their privacy. I'll send you tonight, actually, an email with those 3 disclosures with their identities redacted.
Yeah, I don't want that. I don't want the identities.
I'll be tweeting about that further over the next week because it's just unacceptable. We had in May 2020 over 150 doctors sign a letter. We had all of the collective bargaining, all the unions that work with AHS raise issues about these VANCH masks, and for AHS to not provide the MSDS to their unions, not provide it in a follow-up request, not provided an open letter by 150 doctors, and then see all of the issues with allergies, eye irritations, skin irritations, contact dermatitis, other issues from these workers. It's abusive and it's disgusting. I just got held up for a while because I had to really go through the disclosures carefully so that I myself was not breaching people's privacies by repeating or amplifying or recirculating those disclosures. So that's what I had. I really wanted to, the messages I want to talk about was from the case of AHS versus defendant. It was the types of tort that AHS is trying to apply to protect its employees. And from the VANCH mask, a preview of the hypocrisy in not doing so when they put a blue 3-ply polypropylene mask on their face that gives them skin irritations.
There we go. Thanks, man.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. I think that gets us through all of our speakers for the evening. And now it's time for the thank yous. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who decided to speak up, to share some thoughts, to ask some questions. That is, it's so what this is all about. And one of the things, as you'll hear the tagline at the end, one of the things that's critically important for this province is that we get better at having conversations. We get better at treating each other civilly, even when we disagree. Critically important. So thank you to everybody who weighed in on the Twitter Spaces tonight. As always, thank you to everybody who was in the live chat, whether you were on the YouTubes or on the Facebook. I saw that there was a little bit of spiciness going on in there tonight, especially on the Facebook. We'll go in and clean those comments out later. But thank you to everybody who participated and shared your thoughts on there. Thank you to everybody who was just listening or watching, whether it was on the Twitter Spaces that you were listening, whether you're watching on Twitter, whether you're watching on Facebook, whether you're watching on YouTube. Thank you so much for choosing to spend a little time with us tonight. And this is where I'm gonna do the little plug. We got some content coming up. We got us an episode. I've already talked about it a little bit, but I'm so excited. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. We've got like an hour and a half almost where we sat down earlier this week with former deputy premier, former MLA, former cabinet minister, Thomas Lukasik, the Honorable Thomas Lukasik. And he shares some thoughts not only about the current political climate in the province of Alberta and some of the existential, and like we talk about this where every election is the most important election ever, but this is different, and Thomas does a really effective job of spelling out why it's different, because this isn't just about competing political views or competing ideologies. It's very much, to his appraisal, about a rejection of the norms and the rules that allow our democracy to function or not. We're going to have that whole conversation up tomorrow for all of our Patreon sponsors. And if you want to be one of our Patreon sponsors, you can be a Patreon sponsor at www.patreon.com/thebreakdowneb, where you get early access to all of our interview episodes. We haven't figured out how to do early access to the live stuff yet. Hopefully we'll have a DeLorean shortly and we'll be able to make that happen. But in the meantime, you get early access to all of our interview episodes. The episode will go live Wednesday night for everybody else, and then it will be available as a podcast and everything else on Thursday morning. It is, we've had some intense conversations on the show. We've had some insight from people on the inside of things on the show. before. The conversation with Mr. Lukasik, I think, is probably one of the most. It's a bucket of cold water right in the face for a lot of different reasons, and Mr. Lukasik does not pull any punches whatsoever. So that's definitely one that you're not going to want to miss. That'll be out on, like I said, tomorrow night for our Patreon sponsors. Wednesday night it will be broadcast. Thursday the podcast will be out, and we'll be back again next Sunday for another live show. And then we got some other stuff planned. We're going to be hopefully doing some panel conversations with some folks from a couple of the different political parties who are running in the next election. We're working on setting some of those up. If you are listening tonight and you're one of the candidates in the next election, send us a DM. We'd love to hear from you. It's kind of hard to know who's going to talk to us and who's not allowed to talk to us and all of that kind of stuff. So if you want to have a conversation and you're running in the next election, unless your name's Arthur, in which case you can fuck right off. But otherwise, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, honestly, to everybody who participated tonight and everybody who has listened. It's only going to get more nutty in this wonderful little province of ours. It's going to be a bumpy ride. So as always, make sure that you're taking breaks, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. But while all of that is going on, especially for the next month, it's probably going to be the most important month of the next 4 years. That's not hyperbole. Thomas's comments, I think that, as you'll hear, will back me up on that. Have some conversations with folks. Make it a goal to talk to at least one person about what you care about in this province this week, because it's critically important. That's what we got. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great week. We will see you live next Sunday. And in the meantime, keep the conversation going.
Thank you.